Hello, dear friends, and welcome back. After a long autumnal hiatus from this channel while I navigated my way through an unholy torrent of work, I'm happy to return to our series at last and to our scheduled lineup of ancient Roman divinities. If you're watching this, I'm happy you've found your way back here too. It's been a while. A warm welcome to you and also to those new viewers who have subscribed while I've been absent. I hope you're all well out there in the world and that the gods have been smiling upon you. The next few videos might come a bit haphazardly as things settle down, but we're back in action and we should soon be back to the regular Friday uploads. So in case you've forgotten in the interim what we're doing in this series, or in case you've stumbled upon this channel randomly and have subscribed without watching the very first episode where I explain, let me take the chance to remind you now and refresh your memories that this series, The Forgotten Gods of Rome, is dedicated to the world of ancient Roman religion beyond the dazzling gods of classical antiquity and beneath the timeless allure of those famous Greek myths. We're exploring the forgotten world of Roman religion, a world of lost deities, vanished temples, and prayers swallowed by time. The aim is to uncover a religious landscape long since obscured both by the ravages of history and by an old and outdated habit, which is unfortunately still prevalent, of privileging Greek culture over Roman, to assume that Roman gods were simply borrowed or worse, stolen from Greek ones, and to repeat with unwarranted confidence the dreadful untruth that Roman religion was simply a derivative and corrupted version of Greek religion. We're about halfway through the series at this point, and those who have been following along will hopefully remember, if I haven't been away too long, that we've already seen that the Roman world was in fact populated in every nook and cranny with the numinous and its rich pantheon of deities, while often, though not always overlapping with Greek counterparts, were often also very different, very culturally specific, reflecting Roman character and attitudes and outlooks, and the rhythms of Roman life, both urban and rustic, personal and public, domestic and civic. From dizzy heights to humble, lowly practicalities, our task here is to step out of the dazzle of the familiar into a vast, rich but dimly lit world, flickering at the very edges of memory, to recover its gods, its sacred spaces, and the memories buried with it, beneath the surface of history, and to piece together the fragments of a religion that once shaped an empire. And so, for the first time in a while, and without further ado, let us foray together once more into the shadows of Olympus. Appropriately, for the next few episodes, we'll be seeking out some deities of darkness, magic, and the night. But before making our way back to the streets of Rome and those long roads that rolled out like ribbons out of the ancient capital and parcelled up the empire with paving stones, I want to make a brief stop in the streets of 18th century London to consider the cobbles of that heaving English metropolis. Very different to ancient Rome in so many ways, it was, in other ways, quite similar too, and it was drawing on the similarities and making a conscious comparison between the streets of London of his day and the streets of ancient Rome that the poet John Gay wrote a poem in the year 1716. The poem is called Trivia, or The Art of Walking the Streets of London. And since Trivia is the goddess upon whom we make our visitation in this episode, this is a good place to start. In the poem, John Gay called upon Trivia and beseeched her as his muse, just as the ancient epic poets always called upon a divine muse. But the poem isn't really epic. It imitates the Roman satirists, who often wrote colourful, vitriolic descriptions of life in the ancient city. And riffing on his ancient counterparts, Gay gives tongue-in-cheek advice about how to survive the streets of London in the early 1700s. From pickpockets and thieves to the dangers of errant chamber pots, runaway carts, and collapsing buildings, there's much an ancient Roman would recognize and sympathize with. The poem begins like this. Through winter streets to steer your course aright, how to walk clean by day and safe by night, how jostling crowds with prudence to decline, when to assert the wall and when resign. I sing, thou trivia, goddess, aid my song, through spacious streets conduct thy bard along. By thee transported I securely stray, where winding alleys lead the doubtful way. The silent court and opening square explore, and long perplexing lanes untrod before. Gay thus calls upon the goddess as he embarks on his poetic ramblings around the rough and raucous urban arteries of pre-modern London. He asks Trivia to guide him as he ventures down those alleyways and back streets and across unfamiliar squares. The trick during the day, he says, is how to stay clean, but at night the more pressing concern is how to stay safe. This was only 400 years ago as opposed to 2000, which reminds us that it wasn't so very long ago that a wander through the city streets wasn't necessarily a pleasant stroll, but an adventure and a risk. And of course, today there are still many cities or parts of cities where staying clean is still challenging and walking about is unfortunately dangerous. In a world without streetlights, mobile phones, police patrols, CCTV and law enforcement, you can see how the dangers multiply and how wandering off into the darkness of a city at night was very much a trip into the unknown. In ancient Rome, just like Hanoverian London, it could simply be a jolly to the local taverna for a game of dice and a few poccola of whatever wine the bartender was pouring, but it could also be a short jaunt from which you, or your possessions, might never return. John Gay knew his ancient history well, and his choice of muse for his walk and for his poem was well informed. Though his subject matter was the grit and grime of the English capital, by invoking this particular goddess, he cued his readers into a more ancient realm of uncertainty and peril. The streets of ancient Rome were every bit as busy, filthy, and opportunistic. Streets were the pulsating arteries through which all the business and lifeblood of empire flowed, and they were charged and fraught with a variety of fears from the practical to the existential. And this is because they marked a kind of boundary, and we know from other episodes and other deities, such as Terminus, for example, that Roman society approached boundaries with trepidation and a kind of reverential dread. Boundaries were liminal, meaning they were transitional. They marked thresholds, and as such they sat between places, between worlds, simultaneously straddling places and states. And this sort of borderline and this in-between zone, the ambiguous connection between places, between one thing and another, is, when you think about it, exactly what a street is, and what a street or road does. And so by their very nature, to a Roman mind, the paved byways and alleyways of their world were distinctly liminal, and crooks and thieves notwithstanding, journeying along them was in itself something deserving of some degree of trepidation. So when one road met another, it was a threshold on top of a threshold, and where several roads collided, at the intersection of multiple paths, all these thresholds merged into a point of intense liminality. Accordingly, for Romans, crossroads were charged places, just as travellers, strangers, and friends tended to meet and gather at them. So too restless spirits might drift and cluster in these neither here nor there locations. They were thought volatile and prone to hauntings. Crossroads, if not properly propitiated and attended to, were places where the netherworld might erupt. and Crossroads were the domain of the goddess, to whom we now turn, the presiding deity of this episode, upon whom we call, like the poet John Gay, to take us on our own journey through the ancient city streets, from back alleys to long, straight Roman highways. Let us light our torches and stick carefully to the marked path as we step from the howling crossroads into the very bowels of Hades. Let us enter the realm of trivia. By name, Trivia was the goddess of the crossroads, the goddess of the triple way. The Latin for street or road is via or via. We often translate it way, like the famous Via Appia, the Appian Road or the Appian Way. So Trivia literally means something like three roads or triple way. It comes from the Latin trivium, which is the place where three roads meet, referring specifically to crossroads. And we'll see a little later in this episode how we may derive our English words trivia and trivial from this somewhat unlikely source. This triple form goddess, whose name Virgil tells us was howled by night at the city crossroads, had a haunting and powerful presence, emanating all the foreboding of Stygian night. Stygian, meaning dark, gloomy, and ominous, is an adjective derived from the river Styx, the mythical river of no return that marked the boundary between the living earth and the underworld, and Trivia as a deity that straddled intersecting paths, and just this way was a goddess who always had one foot in the nether darkness, though she might, if well disposed, help light your way through it. Trivia's triple gaze was believed to watch over those perilous passages into unknown realms. Her three heads have been variously associated with the huntress Diana, a moon goddess of the wilderness, Luna, the goddess of the moon itself, Proserpina, the reluctant queen of the underworld, and even Greek Hecate, otherwise said to be Trivia's Greek counterpart. But these are slippery and changeable associations, so it's best not to be too prescriptive about the identity, if any, of the individual heads. Collectively, they represented the goddess's ability to look in all directions at a crossroads, or her power in all three realms, the world, the underworld, and the heavens, or else, as the 1st century BCE antiquarian Varro suggested, she is said to be the moon, which moves in the sky by tres viae, three ways, upwards, sideways, and onwards. This is an idea repeated in the late 1st century CE by Plutarch, who states, "Nor is the moon indeed moved by only one motion, but is, as they were wont to call her, Trivia, or the three-wayed, performing her course together according to length, breadth, and depth in the zodiac." At any rate, she was associated with the night, with ghosts and magic and witchcraft, and as such, she was fearsome, just as her domain was volatile and frightening. But she was potentially your salvation in that dark realm. Her torches, with which she was regularly depicted, might lead you safely on your way. She was the guardian of the crossroads, closely associated with dogs, whose howling at the moon by night might well be thought to have been invoking her name, just as Virgil described. Dogs themselves were loyal, if ferocious guardians, and their connection to the goddess was well suited, since their associations with magic and the underworld was also well established in both Greek and Roman culture. Dogs were known to be alert and perceptive creatures. A dog that barked suddenly for no apparent reason was sometimes thought to be sensing the presence of a ghost, if not Trivia herself. Shrines to Trivia and Hecate were often accompanied by an image of a dog, and not coincidentally, the three-headed form of the goddess recalled that ultimate guard dog Cerberus, the three-headed canine terror who guarded the entrance to Hades. So the goddess is shrouded in darkness and danger, and her associations with the underworld and the black arts make her a charged character. You can feel emanating from her that same friction of conflicting emotions and trepidation that you get in the presence of a giant barking dog. Is this a good boy, or are you about to be mauled and expedited from this life? Much depends on which side of the fence you're standing and where you ought to be standing. And so trivia, standing at the thresholds and crossings, both real and worldly as well as otherworldly and metaphysical, is a formidable but ambiguous protectress. Ovid vividly describes the so-called barbarian Thracians sacrificing dog entrails to Trivia, an unfortunate testimony to her appetite for canine offerings. Such sacrifices at Crossroads underscore her chthonic character. Although she wasn't included on Rome's official festival calendar and didn't have an official allocated festival day like so many of the other gods we've encountered in this series, her worship was widespread. Crossroads were literally everywhere, and as the Romans knew very well, outside the city walls, Trivia was propitiated at night, with offerings left at intersections to appease restless spirits and let travellers pass on their way. The poet, Tibullus, describes making midnight offerings to Trivia to try and stop his girlfriend suffering from nightmares. You may, if you have a good memory, remember Horace's description of witches scavenging in the gardens of Libitina among the open graves for bones for their nefarious spells. Those were literary witches, not real ones, of course, but insofar as real ones did exist, which is to say in the ancient practices of the black arts, which sought to coerce or circumvent divine power rather than properly propitiate it piously, then their practices automatically brought them into the domain of Trivia and her infernal hounds. In the thought worlds of ancient magic, such deviant religious practices, though fundamentally perceived to be nefarious and dangerous, were also believed to be powerful and efficacious, and people were terribly afraid of falling victim to black magic. So while practitioners, like antiquity's most infamous legendary witch, the beautiful, dastardly and doomed Medea, might call upon the goddess to help them in their sorcery, others might propitiate the same goddess to protect themselves from the harm of spells and curses others might put upon them. Such opposing functions is a common feature among ancient deities. Apollo springs to mind, for example, with the power to inflict plagues upon people or, contrariwise, to heal them from it. And similarly, Trivia's involvement with magic went both ways. So we don't have much in the way of detail as to what her worship entailed in practice, while her mythology and general aspects are the same as Greek Hecate. As so often in the Roman cultural context, she was different and had a different historical trajectory. For one thing, we need to factor in one of the greatest of Roman accomplishments: roads, an enormous empire connected by them, which meant that crossroads were plentiful and ubiquitous. Roads facilitated the movement of troops and ensured a speedy system of imperial communication, but they also facilitated the travel and movement of all sorts of other people: merchants and philosophers, vagabonds and wonder workers, aristocrats heading out to their country estates, and all manner of hopefuls seeking their fortunes on the road and somewhere else. On long journeys by foot, it's natural that people might linger a while at the crossroads, where they might meet people coming from different directions along a different road with news or opportunities. It was a sensible place to try and sell wares to weary travellers, and crossroads like temple porticos are listed in the ancient sources as places where miracle workers and healers and fortune tellers used to gather and harangue the passers-by. Such gatherings of vagrants, voyagers, and various magicians, swindlers, and crooks is well suited to the underworld nature of trivia, and no doubt reinforced her liminal reputation as Rome paved its way forward and around the Mediterranean. Again, people passing through the multifarious and random gatherings at her junctures might seek the goddess's protection from the very people she attracted. Moreover, while you had your eyes on the road ahead, long journeys had their own perils, and you would do well to also glance over your shoulder every now and then. If you weren't subject to a curse or a conversion, you might succumb to the plentiful robbers and bandits who operated gangs along roads and rural highways, waiting to seize travellers and their valuable goods. In this slow progress as you plodded from one place to another along these well-paved but fraught byways, anything could happen. Unless you happened to have access to the imperial mail system or slaves to run your errands, you also had no chance of getting word home. You might entrust a message to a fellow traveller headed in the right direction, but then anything might happen to that traveller along the way. So there was no way of knowing if your message would ever arrive, and it was common for people to set off and not be heard from for a long time, if ever again. So while goodbyes still remain full of unknowable quantities and are often soaked in tears, there was every reason for goodbyes to be all the more sorely felt in the ancient world. And perhaps because I've been a vagabond myself most of my life, I always linger long in museums when I see Roman dedications for travellers, like this one from Rome, wishing for a safe outbound voyage, itus, and a safe return, reditus. The text is accompanied by two pairs of carved feet, one pointing in the outbound direction, like someone headed out the door and down the steps and away, and another pair arriving in the opposite direction, like the traveller come safely home and back at his own front door. So this is a repeated formula. You'll see variations of it around and about, and there's something very touching about it, I think. Here's an altar in a similar vein, also from Rome. The inscription tells us it was dedicated by Titus Albanius Principianus, who, as he tells us himself, was recalled to arms in the service of the emperor. On the right side, we see a personification of a road with a whip in her hand, with an inscription that reads, Salvos ire, farewell going. And on the left side, there's a depiction of the goddess Fortuna, seated with a rudder and a cornucopia in her hand, signifying success, fruition, and plenty. And the inscription reads, Salvos venire, greetings coming back. So we can hope that Titus Albanius did indeed return safely from his long march down that road with the cracking of the whip and his military service in distant lands, to make an offering at last at this very altar and enjoy the fruits of good fortune. Lady Luck was certainly one deity you might propitiate on such a journey, but another could well be trivia. Dedications like these remind us of the dangers and uncertainties inherent in journeys in the ancient world, and the sense of accomplishment, and no doubt relief, when they were safely concluded. Trivia wasn't like Fortuna with her bounteous good graces that might follow you home and fill it with abundance. Trivia was always outside, away, and at the hinterland, at those dark junctures where she stood at the crossroads with her torches ablaze, like an eerie sort of lighthouse, illuminating your onward way. There are a couple of instances in which she's very other and concertedly beyond the pale and bounds of civilized urban life. In a letter from exile, the poet Ovid tells a strange legend to a friend about a temple containing what he calls Trivia's savage altar. The temple was located in Scythia, in the Pontic steppe, specifically in a place called Taurus, which is the Crimea. And so inhabitants of the Greco-Roman world would expect savage behavior in those rugged lands which they considered so uncivilized. However, it wasn't just because the lands were themselves considered barbaric that the particular practices at this temple and at this altar were considered savage. Ovid recounts his tale, describing the temple as having once belonged to Diana, but it no longer had a cult statue of this goddess, and instead the white statue base was stained red with blood. That's because this statue base had been turned into an altar, and its sacrificial victims were strangers to the land, travellers that had stumbled unwittingly into those parts, who were captured and taken with wrists bound to the altar where they were ritually slain by a young virgin with a big knife. The other details of the story need not detain us. It's just interesting that Ovid calls this particular altar and its history of human sacrifice Trivia's savage altar. If nothing else, it reminds us again of the dangers of travel and the perils of straying into unfamiliar lands. But it also cues us into the world of witchcraft and the underworld with which Trivia was always associated. And it's worth noting here also that the poet Statius also refers to another very particular and ancient Roman Diana as Trivia. Apart from Trivia's connections to and occasional conflations with Diana already noted, the significance of this specific Diana and her sacred grove was that it was also associated with a venerable tradition of sacred violence. The sanctuary was located on the shores of Lake Nemi, near the ancient town of Aricia in Latium, Italy, and in it lived a king known as the Rex Nemorensis, or the King of Nemi. The peculiarity about this king, however, was that he was essentially a murderer who had to be constantly on guard, patrolling the grove with sword drawn. And that's because of the succession ritual involved in gaining this position. This comes so hazily out of the mists of time, it's not entirely clear whether this was legend or once upon a time a real practice, but according to the tradition and or the custom, the king could be challenged at any moment, but the only person who was allowed to challenge him was a runaway slave. By plucking a branch from a sacred oak in the grove, the fugitive challenger procured the right to engage the current Rex Nemorensis in a fight to the death. If successful, he became the new king and held the position until he, in turn, was killed by another challenger. As you might imagine, much scholarly ink has been spilled on the historicity, symbolism, and meaning of this very strange rite, but at its heart, it's a sacrificial ritual. And it's interesting in the context of that other violent sacrificial rite we just discussed, by which a Scythian Diana was ousted by Trivia, that Statius should call the Diana of this Italian grove Trivia also. Indeed, there was a perceived connection between the two. The Italian sanctuary was said to have been instituted by the mythological figure Orestes, who had himself once escaped death on that very blood-stained altar in Scythia. His unfortunate travelling companion was slain upon it, but Orestes escaped, conspiring to recover the lost statue of Diana and bring it back to Italy. And this was the mythological origin of the cult of Diana Nemorensis at Aricia, the goddess who presided over the grove of the sacrificial king, and the goddess who Statius also called Trivia. The evidence is too scant to extrapolate anything here, but we can simply notice the fugitive nature of the king, the low social class of his challengers, the liminality of the role, the volatility of the position, and the blood-stained dark practices required to procure it. And note that perhaps something in this combination was indeed evocative of Trivia, and wonder whether one of her faces was, in fact, appearing here. Curiously, the very ancient cult statue of Diana at her sacred grove in Eretria was herself triple-formed. Tripartite images of that cult statue appear on coins and show us that this particular Diana was, as Horace called her, a diva triformis, a three-form goddess. At which point it's not strange that various Romans referred to some versions of Diana as trivia, and we might wonder then to what extent this particular Diana really was trivia or came to be her. As so often in the world of ancient Roman religion, trying to draw hard lines around divine forces is futile, and trying to distinguish deities too exactly or dividing their realms too discreetly and precisely one from the other is a frustrating fool's errand. Sometimes you see the big picture better by standing back and squinting rather than passing out and staring at the individual granules. In any case, black magic was often thought to entail dark sacrifices, so these sacrificial tales add to Trivia's foreboding presence and evoke her world and worship and Roman cult and cultural contexts in localized and geographically specific ways. We've seen this in terms of journeys and travel beyond the relative safety of city walls, but what about within them? There were plenty of intersections and crossroads inside the city too. So before finishing up for today, we should look at those urban crossroads briefly, because here they took on other functional and symbolic layers that were very specific to Rome and Roman society. Just like in the countryside and in far-flung provinces, in cities too people were drawn to crossroads and were inclined to gather and linger there. There were often drinking fountains placed at them, as you can still see in the streets of Pompeii, and at busier crossroads street hawkers might again try to sell their wares, while people peddled all manner of services and promises. But in cities, there were also neighbourhood meeting points. Every neighbourhood had its own neighbourhood crossroad that might be garlanded for festivals, and they were celebrated in their own right at the Compitalia, a yearly festival of the crossroads. The festival honoured the lares compitales, the lares of the crossroads, and if you remember all the way back to episode 6, we looked at the lares of the home, and these were essentially the guardian spirits of the household. The lares compitales were similar, except they looked after the neighbourhood at large and the community. So altars to the lares were a feature of urban crossroads, and they were looked after and given tidbits of food and incense to propitiate them. Trivia might also be propitiated there, but she didn't have the same friendly, communal neighbourhood watch sort of disposition. Taverns, those other great community meeting places, often had outdoor seating areas that spilled out onto the street. So urban crossroads could be busy places, bustling with chatter and news. When someone actually wanted news to be circulated widely, announcements were made around the city crossroads, and an unofficial network of crossroads made for an effective system of getting word out quickly. Of course, rumour and gossip spread in this way too, as well as news the authorities might rather have suppressed. Busy urban crossroads thus took on political undertones because they acted like ancient information highways which couldn't be entirely controlled. There are a few historical upshots from this situation. One is that when Augustus finally took power firmly in his hands and became the first of Rome's long line of emperors, these crossroads and their chatter became too much of a liability for an authoritarian ruler so preoccupied with controlling the narrative. How he dealt with them was a stroke of genius, literally. You may remember that when we talked about the household gods, alongside the lares, there was also a genius loci, or spirit of the place. This was a divine presence, not necessarily in human form, that inhabited and protected specific places, whether those places were houses or woodland groves or indeed crossroads. So while trivia might already be there, alongside the lares compitales, Augustus assigned his own spirit, or genius. As the genius loci of the crossroads, he thereby boldly positioned himself at every crossroad in spirit, as a guardian ostensibly, but simultaneously a deterrent and warning. Thus, the divine Augustan spirit was born, the Genius Augusti, and it loitered on street corners, receiving praise and adoration and tidbits of food and flowers, an omnipresent force coercing people to step in line with the political regime. Or, if you want to be more optimistic about it, it was a way of bringing the common people into the imperial system, using existing religious structures to promote unity and loyalty to Augustus. Now, I know the imperial cult is of interest to at least one viewer who's been a great supporter of this channel by asking questions, making interesting and funny observations, and generally keeping me company in the comments. And I haven't forgotten that I promised to make a mini-series about the cult of the divine emperors in the future. But for now, this is one crucial place to take good note of if you're interested in that topic. This worship of the imperial genius is fairly subtle and indirect, but nevertheless it was a giant step on the emperor's way to becoming a god. At this moment in history, Augustus was very much a man, and the thought that a Roman politician might actually be or become divine was still absurd. Times would change, but that's a story for another day. But to return finally to trivia. Now, if you wanted to play down the chatter of the plebs, as Augustus evidently did, and if you wanted to undermine the veracity of news transmitted at crossroads down the urban information highways, and if you wanted to suggest that none of it was very important, you could say that it was trivial. And if you happen to pick up a little bit of information from that network of chattering citizens, or a piece of news from further afield, maybe a curious fact that had travelled to you from afar along those long straight Roman roads, you might say you had a piece of trivia. Is that the etymology of these words? The jury is out. It certainly wasn't the ancient usage. There was nothing trivial about the goddess Trivia, as I hope I've shown. She was formidable and powerful, but it seems these words might have come into later use in English due to the classical knowledge of Old English scholars. Knowledge put to use, for example, in the poem with which we started, John Gay's poem from the 1700s, invoking Trivia as his muse. Trivial is first found in print in 16th century English, while trivia with a small t appears in the 18th century. I have to be honest and admit that there are a few other suggested etymologies, but I want to believe that it comes from the goddess, and that big T trivia became small t trivia as she trivialized over time. And Latin did have the adjective trivialus, meaning found everywhere, common, commonplace, vulgar, and ordinary, which, if not describing the power of the goddess, at least attested to the ubiquity of her crossroads and the general attitude towards the crowds that she attracted there. And with that, dear friends, it's time to end this trivial pursuit and leave you to carry on your way. May it be merry, clean by day and safe by night. And at this crossroad where we part, I bid you farewell going, and hope in the next episode to meet you once again with greetings coming back.